priest stands at the door. His eyes burn with righteous fury. "You dishonor God," he says, pointing at the carved turnip flickering on her doorstep. Margaret doesn't flinch. She meets his gaze and speaks the words that will seal her fate. "My grandmother honored the dead this way, so will I." By dawn, the soldiers come. They drag her from her home in chains. Her children scream. Her neighbors watch in silence, too terrified to intervene. What happens next will echo through centuries, a warning carved into the bones of history itself. Some crimes, the church declared, were unforgivable. Celebrating the old ways was one of them, and Margaret O'Sullivan was about to learn that there are punishments far worse than a quick death. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The story begins in 1652 in a small settlement along the Massachusetts coast where Irish and Scottish immigrants had carved out a fragile existence. The autumn wind carried the salt of the Atlantic and the smoke of harvest fires. It was October 30th, the eve of what the church now called All Hallows Day. But what the old people still whispered was Samhain, the night when the veil between worlds grew thin. Margaret O'Sullivan had crossed the ocean 5 years earlier, fleeing the devastation that armies had wrought upon her homeland. She brought with her the memories of her grandmother's hands lighting the bonfire, of turnips carved with faces to ward off malevolent spirits, of food left at the threshold for ancestors who might wander home on this sacred night. These traditions were older than Christianity itself, rooted in the Celtic understanding of death, not as an ending, but as a transformation, a journey to the other world that ran parallel to their own. In the new world, Margaret had tried to be invisible. She attended church services. She bowed her head during prayers. She kept her customs private, practiced only within the walls of her small timber house, where her 3 children slept on straw mattresses and her husband's tools hung from wooden pegs. But invisibility, she would learn, was impossible when fear ruled the hearts of men. The troubles began when her neighbor, Goodwife Parsons, saw Margaret placing a bowl of milk and bread outside her door on the evening of October 30th. It was a simple gesture, an offering for the spirits of her ancestors. Margaret had done this every year since arriving in the settlement, but this year was different. This year the new minister, Reverend Blackwell, had arrived from Boston with fire in his sermons and suspicion in his heart. Reverend Blackwell was a thin man, with a face like carved stone, and eyes that seemed to look straight through flesh to the condition of one's soul. He had been educated at Cambridge, had studied the writings of the Church Fathers, and had developed an absolute conviction that the new world was infected with paganism that must be purged with the same vigor that the Church had used in Europe centuries before. He spoke often of the great campaigns against the Druids, of how the Church had established All Saints' Day to replace the heathen festival of Samhain, of how the faithful must remain vigilant against the old ways that refused to die. When Goodwife Parsons came to him with her report, breathless, scandalized, eager to demonstrate her own piety, Reverend Blackwell saw an opportunity. Here was a chance to make an example, to show the settlement what happened to those who clung to darkness when the light of Christ had been offered. The morning of October 31st broke cold and grey over the settlement. Margaret was at her hearth stirring porridge for her children when the knock came. Not the gentle tap of a neighbor borrowing flour, but the hard, authoritative pounding of men who expected doors to open immediately. Her husband, Thomas, was already out in the fields. Her eldest daughter, Catherine, only 12 years old, clutched her younger siblings as Margaret opened the door. 3 men stood there, Reverend Blackwell in his black coat and white collar, 2 town constables flanking him, their faces grim and uncomfortable. Behind them, a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the promise of spectacle. "Margaret O'Sullivan," Reverend Blackwell said, his voice carrying across the morning air, "you are accused of practicing pagan rituals in defiance of God's holy church. You have been witnessed leaving offerings to spirits, engaging in heathen customs, and leading others astray by your example." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "I left food for my dead grandmother. I carved a turnip as she taught me. I honor my ancestors. This is not against God." "You honor demons," Reverend Blackwell corrected, his voice rising. "You invoke the old darkness. You practice the forbidden rites of Samhain, that devil's festival that the Church has spent centuries eradicating from Christian lands. Do you deny this?" "I deny nothing," Margaret said. The words came out stronger than she expected. Behind her, Catherine whimpered. "My grandmother was a good woman. She taught me these customs. They harm no one. "They harm your immortal soul," Reverend Blackwell said, "and they poison this community with your example. You will come with us. You will answer before the congregation and the magistrate." One of the constables stepped forward, a length of rope in his hands. He looked apologetic, but he didn't hesitate. They bound her wrists in front of her body, the rough hemp cutting into her skin. "Mama!" Catherine screamed, trying to rush forward. Margaret turned, her eyes fierce. "Stay with your brother and sister," she commanded. "Do not leave this house. Your father will be home soon. Tell him what happened. Tell him I said to stay silent and keep you safe." They led her through the settlement. Every door opened. Every face watched. Women whispered behind their hands. Men stood with arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Children pointed. The morning had the quality of a nightmare, every step taking her further from her life and closer to something she couldn't yet name. The meeting house stood at the center of the settlement, a plain wooden building with a steeple and cross. Inside, the benches had been arranged to form a kind of court. The magistrate, Elder Whitmore, sat at a table with the colony's record book open before him. He was an older man, grey-bearded, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much harshness in his years. Reverend Blackwell positioned Margaret at the center of the room. The constables stood on either side of her. The townspeople filed in, filling the benches until the air grew thick with breath and body heat and collective anticipation. "Margaret O'Sullivan," Elder Whitmore began, his voice weary, "you stand accused of practicing pagan customs, specifically those associated with the Celtic festival of Samhain, in violation of the laws of this colony and the teachings of the Holy Church. How do you answer?" Margaret lifted her chin. Her wrists ached where the rope bit into them. "I placed food on my doorstep to honor my dead grandmother. I carved a turnip as she taught me when I was a child. These are the customs of my people. I mean no harm to anyone." "Your people," Reverend Blackwell interjected, stepping forward, "were pagans. The Celts worshipped false gods. They believed the dead walked among the living. They made blood sacrifices to appease spirits. These practices are an abomination before the Lord." "I made no blood sacrifice," Margaret said firmly. "I left bread and milk. I lit a candle. I prayed for the souls of my ancestors." "You prayed to them," Reverend Blackwell corrected. "You invoked them. You opened a door to the spirit world on the very night when darkness is strongest. Do you not understand that Samhain is the devil's holy day? That for centuries the Church has fought to replace that evil festival with All Saints' Day to sanctify what was once profane?" The room murmured. Heads nodded. The word devil hung in the air like smoke. "I do not worship the devil," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "I am a Christian woman. I attend services. I raise my children in the faith. But I also remember where I came from. I remember my grandmother, who showed me kindness when no one else did. Is that truly a crime worthy of this?" Elder Whitmore sighed. He rubbed his face with one weathered hand. "Margaret, the laws of this colony are clear. We fled England to build a godly society, free from corruption and false worship. We cannot allow the old superstitions to take root here. If we permit one person to practice pagan rites, others will follow. The community will fracture. Chaos will reign." "I only wanted to remember my dead," Margaret whispered. "Then remember them in church," Reverend Blackwell said coldly, "on All Saints' Day, in the manner prescribed by Scripture, not in the darkness with pagan symbols and offerings to wandering spirits." Elder Whitmore leaned back in his chair. The room fell silent, waiting for his judgment. The magistrate's eyes moved across Margaret's face, seeing the fear she tried to hide, the defiance she couldn't quite suppress. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he said finally, "I find you guilty of practicing pagan customs in defiance of this colony's laws and the teachings of the Church. You will be punished as an example to others who might be tempted to follow the old ways." Margaret's breath caught. "What punishment?" Elder Whitmore glanced at Reverend Blackwell, who nodded with grim satisfaction. "You will be placed in the stocks for 3 days and 3 nights, beginning this evening. You will be denied food and water. The townspeople may witness your punishment and reflect upon the wages of disobedience. If, at the end of that time, you publicly renounce your pagan practices and beg forgiveness from God and this community, you will be released. If you refuse, further measures will be taken." The room erupted in whispers. 3 days without food or water was a brutal sentence, especially in the cold of late October. Margaret swayed on her feet, but the constables held her upright. "This is mercy," Reverend Blackwell added, his voice rising above the noise. In other lands, in other times, those who practiced the rites of Samhain were burned, their property was seized, their families were cast out. We offer Margaret a chance at redemption. She need only confess her error and turn back to the light. Margaret said nothing. She couldn't speak past the thickness in her throat, the terror that clamped around her chest like iron bands. They took her outside. In the center of the settlement's common ground stood the stocks, a wooden frame with holes for neck and wrists. The constables unlocked the upper beam, positioned Margaret's head and hands, then locked it again, trapping her in a bent, helpless posture. The wood was rough and splintered. The position forced her to hunch forward, her back screaming with strain almost immediately. The constables stepped back. The townspeople gathered in a loose circle, watching. Reverend Blackwell raised his arms to the sky. "Let this be a lesson. Let all who see Margaret O'Sullivan remember that the old ways are dead. We have come to this new world to build God's kingdom. There is no place here for darkness, for superstition, for the devil's festivals. All who celebrate Samhain or practice pagan customs will face God's justice." The crowd murmured its assent. Some faces showed pity, others showed righteous vindication. Children stared with wide, frightened eyes, learning a lesson they would carry into adulthood. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd slowly dispersed. Margaret was left alone in the stocks, her body already aching, her mind racing. She thought of her children, she thought of Thomas, who would return from the fields to find his wife gone and his home shadowed by scandal. She thought of her grandmother, whose face she could barely remember now, but whose hands she still felt sometimes in dreams, gentle and warm. The hours crawled past. The sun moved across the sky. Margaret's throat grew dry. Her legs trembled from holding her weight in the awkward position. People passed by occasionally, some hurrying past without looking, others stopping to stare or mutter prayers. As twilight approached, the sky turned the color of bruises. The temperature dropped. Margaret shivered in her thin dress. Her wrists were raw where the wood chafed them. Her neck ached. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the only words that came were the old words her grandmother had taught her, the prayer for the dead spoken on Samhain night. "May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rain fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of his hand." She whispered it over and over, a litany against the darkness gathering around her. And as the first stars appeared in the cold October sky, Margaret O'Sullivan understood that this punishment was designed not just to hurt her body, but to break her spirit. What the church could not erase through conversion, it would erase through fear. What could not be forgotten willingly would be beaten out through suffering. But deep in her heart, in the place where her grandmother's voice still lived, Margaret made a decision. She would endure, she would survive, and she would remember, not just for herself, but for all those who came before her, all those whose traditions had been burned and buried and condemned. The old ways might die, but they would not die in her. Not yet. Not without a fight. The night deepened, the temperature plummeted, and Margaret O'Sullivan, trapped in the stocks under a sky full of stars, began the longest 3 days of her life. The first night in the stocks was the coldest Margaret had ever known, not because the temperature dropped below freezing, though it did, not because the wind cut through her thin dress like knives, though it did that too. The cold came from inside, from the realization that she was utterly alone, exposed to the elements and the judgment of an entire community that had decided she was dangerous. Her neck throbbed where the wooden beam pressed against her throat. Her wrists bled where the rough wood scraped her skin with every tiny movement. Her back felt like it might snap from the unnatural angle, but worse than all of that was the thirst. By midnight of the first night, her tongue had begun to swell in her mouth. By dawn, her lips were cracked and bleeding. The townspeople emerged from their homes as the sun rose. They went about their business, drawing water from the well, feeding chickens, hanging laundry, but their paths all seemed to lead past the stocks, past Margaret. Some looked at her with pity, others with contempt. Children were brought by their parents and made to stare, to understand what happened to those who defied God's law. "Remember this," mothers whispered to their daughters. "This is what pride brings. See what happens," fathers told their sons, "when you put the old ways before the truth." Margaret tried to hold her head up, tried to meet their eyes with dignity, but by the second morning, she could barely lift her gaze from the ground. Her vision swam, her body shook with cold and exhaustion. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep in this position, and dehydration was making her thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. Thomas came on the second day. Margaret heard his voice before she saw him, arguing with one of the constables who stood guard to ensure no one gave her food or water. "She's my wife, let me speak to her." Elder Whitmore's orders, no contact, she's serving her sentence. "She'll die out here. That's her choice. She can renounce her pagan ways at any time." Thomas appeared in Margaret's limited field of vision. His face was haggard, his eyes red from sleeplessness or tears or both. He fell to his knees in front of the stocks, careful not to touch her, knowing the constable was watching. "Margaret," he whispered, "the children are terrified. Catherine hasn't stopped crying. Just tell them what they want to hear. Say you were wrong. Say you'll stop. Please." Margaret's voice came out as a croak, barely audible. "I can't." "Why not?" Thomas's voice broke. "Why can't you just lie? Say the words they want. We'll practice our customs in secret, in our home where no one can see. But don't die for this. Don't leave our children without a mother for a bowl of milk and a carved turnip." Tears tracked down Margaret's filthy face. "If I say I was wrong, if I say my grandmother was wrong, then what was her life? What were all those years of tradition? I'd be saying her memory means nothing, that she means nothing. She's dead." "Margaret, the dead are gone, but our children are alive. I'm alive. Choose us." The constable stepped forward. "Enough. Move along, O'Sullivan, or you'll join her." Thomas stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Margaret thought he might strike the constable, might do something reckless that would destroy their family completely. But he didn't. He turned and walked away, his shoulders shaking. That was the moment Margaret felt something inside her begin to crack. Not her resolve, that remained solid as stone, but something else. Her connection to the life she'd known, her place in this community, her future. She understood now that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same. The second night was worse than the first. A cold rain began to fall just after sunset, soaking Margaret to the skin. She shivered so violently that her teeth chattered, making her already aching jaw scream with pain. Water ran into her eyes, her mouth. She tried to catch raindrops on her tongue to ease her thirst, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. People hurried past with their heads down, escaping the rain. No one stopped. No one offered shelter. Margaret was alone in the darkness, alone with the rain and the cold and the knowledge that she might actually die here. Somewhere in the depths of that second night, she began to hallucinate. She saw her grandmother standing at the edge of the common ground, young and strong as she'd been in the stories, with her red hair unbound and her eyes bright. She was lighting a bonfire that rose higher and higher, pushing back the darkness. "You're not real," Margaret whispered through cracked lips. Her grandmother smiled. "Does it matter? You're remembering me. That's all I ever needed. To be remembered. I'm dying." "We all die, little one. The question is what we die for." The vision faded. The rain continued. Margaret's body shook itself toward collapse. By the morning of the third day, she could no longer stand. Her legs had given out completely. She hung from the stocks, held up only by her neck and wrists, strangling herself with her own weight. The constables had to prop a wooden crate beneath her feet, just to keep her from suffocating. Reverend Blackwell came at midday. He stood before her, his black coat spotless, his face serene. He held a cup of water in his hands, and the sight of it made Margaret moan involuntarily. "All you have to do is confess," he said gently. "Say that you were wrong. Say that Samhain is a pagan abomination. Renounce your grandmother's teachings. Accept that the Church has sanctified this day as All Saints' Day, and that the old ways must die. Say these things, and I will give you this water. I will release you. You can go home to your family." Margaret's vision blurred. She could barely focus on his face. The cup of water was all she could see, all she could think about. Her body screamed at her to say the words, to end this suffering, to choose life, but her grandmother's voice echoed in her failing mind, to be remembered. "No," Margaret whispered. Reverend Blackwell's face hardened. "You're choosing death over reason, choosing pride over your own children. Do you understand what that makes you?" "Free," Margaret said. The word came out barely audible, but Reverend Blackwell heard it. His jaw tightened. He poured the water onto the ground at her feet, letting it soak into the dirt. Wasted. Then he turned and walked away. The crowd that had gathered murmured. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded in grim satisfaction. Margaret O'Sullivan had made her choice. But then something unexpected happened. An old woman stepped forward from the crowd. Margaret recognized her vaguely. Mistress MacLeod. a Scottish widow who lived at the edge of the settlement and rarely spoke to anyone. She was bent with age, her face weathered as old leather, her eyes sharp as broken glass. She walked directly to the stocks, ignoring the constable's warnings. She pulled a small flask from beneath her shawl and held it to Margaret's lips, letting water trickle into her mouth. "Stop!" the constable shouted, rushing forward. Mistress MacLeod didn't stop. She let Margaret drink 3 long swallows before the constable pulled her away. "My grandmother taught me too," the old woman said loudly, looking not at the constable but at the crowd. "Taught me to light the fires on Samhain night, taught me to remember the dead. I left Scotland thinking I could forget, thinking I could become something new. But I can't, won't." The constable seized her arm. "You're confessing to pagan practices?" "Aye," Mistress MacLeod said. "I am." Before anyone could react, another voice called out. A middle-aged man, Connor Walsh, stepped forward. "My father told me stories of Samhain, of the thin places between worlds. I carved a turnip this year. For him. He died last winter, and I wanted him to know I remembered." The crowd stirred. Murmurs of shock and confusion rippled through the gathered townspeople. Reverend Blackwell's face went pale, then red with fury. "This is insanity. You're all condemning yourselves." But a third person stepped forward, then a fourth, then more. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. A dozen people standing together, admitting that they too had kept small fragments of the old ways alive. A carved turnip here, a whispered prayer there, a candle lit in memory. Elder Whitmore stood from his position near the meeting house, his face grave. "This is unprecedented," he said. "What are you all doing?" Mistress MacLeod spoke for them all. "We're remembering who we were before we became what you told us to be. We're honoring our dead. We're saying that Margaret O'Sullivan shouldn't die alone for something we've all done." Reverend Blackwell's voice shook with rage. "You're admitting to heresy, to paganism. You'll all be punished." "Then punish us all," Mistress MacLeod said calmly. "Build more stocks, string us all up. But you'll have no one left to tend your fields or bake your bread or birth your children. You'll have a settlement of prisoners and guards, and nothing else." The crowd fell silent. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Elder Whitmore looked from Reverend Blackwell to the gathered confessors to Margaret, still trapped in the stocks, barely conscious. Finally, the magistrate sighed deeply. "Release her." "What?" Reverend Blackwell whirled on him. "She hasn't confessed. She hasn't renounced." "I said, release her." Elder Whitmore's voice carried absolute authority. 3 days is enough. She's half dead already, and I will not tear this community apart over turnips and milk." The constable moved to unlock the stocks. The beam lifted. Margaret collapsed immediately, her legs unable to support her. Thomas, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, rushed forward and caught her before she hit the ground. She felt his arms around her, felt him lifting her, carrying her away from that terrible place. She heard voices, arguing, shouting, praying, but they seemed to come from very far away. Her body had shut down. Her mind floated somewhere between consciousness and darkness. Thomas carried her home. Catherine and the younger children wept when they saw her, their mother reduced to this broken, shaking creature. Thomas laid her in their bed and wrapped her in every blanket they owned. He brought water, just sips at first, then more as her body remembered how to swallow. For 2 days, Margaret drifted in and out of fevered dreams. She saw her grandmother's fire. She saw faces of ancestors she'd never known. She saw the thin places between worlds opening up, showing her glimpses of something vast and ancient and beautiful. When she finally woke fully, Thomas was sitting beside the bed, his hand holding hers. "The others," Margaret croaked. "Mistress MacLeod and the rest. They weren't punished," Thomas said quietly. "Elder Whitmore and Reverend Blackwell argued for hours, but in the end nothing happened to them. The magistrate said he wouldn't prosecute a dozen families for private customs. It would destroy the settlement. So I won." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "You nearly died. They still call you a heretic. Reverend Blackwell preaches against you every Sunday. But yes, in a way you won. You kept your grandmother's memory, and you showed others they didn't have to forget either." Margaret closed her eyes. Her body ached in 1,000 places. She would bear scars from this, physical and otherwise, for the rest of her life, but she had survived. And more than that, she had remembered. Outside, November had arrived. All Saints' Day had passed. The veil between worlds had closed once more, but in a dozen homes throughout the settlement, turnips had been carved, offerings had been left, prayers had been spoken in the old tongue. The church had tried to erase Samhain, had tried to replace it with their own holy day, had tried to make people forget. But memory, Margaret understood now, was stronger than any punishment, stronger than stocks or sermons or threats of damnation. Memory was how the dead stayed alive, and some things, once remembered, could never be fully destroyed. Margaret recovered slowly. Her body healed faster than her spirit. Within a month she could walk without assistance, could work around the house, could hold her youngest child without her arms trembling. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night she woke gasping, feeling the weight of the stocks crushing her neck, tasting the desperate thirst that had nearly killed her. The settlement had changed too. Not dramatically. People still attended church, still followed the magistrate's laws, still lived their ordered, pious lives. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The dozen families who had stood up with Margaret formed a quiet community within the community. They didn't advertise their customs. They didn't challenge the church openly. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind carried whispers, small lights could be seen in windows. Small offerings could be found on doorsteps. Reverend Blackwell noticed. How could he not? His sermons grew increasingly fierce, increasingly focused on the dangers of backsliding into paganism. He spoke of eternal damnation, of hellfire, of how God would not be mocked by those who claim to worship him while secretly honoring demons. The church has fought for centuries to purge these practices, he thundered from the pulpit one Sunday morning in late November. In Ireland, in Scotland, in England, wherever the shadow of paganism fell, the light of Christ drove it back. The Druids were scattered, their groves were burned, their festivals were replaced with holy days. And now, here, in this new world where we came to build something pure and good, we find the old poison creeping back in. Margaret sat in the pew with her family, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral. She had learned the art of invisibility now. She attended every service. She mouthed the prayers. She kept her head bowed. But inside, she nurtured the small flame of defiance that the stocks had failed to extinguish. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the cold morning, Goodwife Parsons, the neighbor who had first reported Margaret, approached with her daughter in tow. The woman's face was pinched with self-righteousness. "Margaret O'Sullivan," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "I pray daily for your soul. I pray that you will truly repent, not just in word but in deed, that you will turn away from the darkness you've embraced." Margaret met her eyes steadily. "I appreciate your concern, Goodwife Parsons. I pray for you as well." The subtle barb wasn't lost on the other woman, whose face flushed red. But before she could respond, Mistress MacLeod appeared at Margaret's elbow, her weathered face arranged in a pleasant smile. "Come along, dear," the old woman said to Margaret. "I promised to show you my recipe for oat bread. You know, the one my grandmother taught me back in Scotland. Family recipes are so important to preserve, don't you think?" The emphasis on the last words was slight but unmistakable. Goodwife Parsons's lips thinned, but she said nothing, simply pulling her daughter away and marching off toward her own home. Margaret and Mistress MacLeod walked together through the settlement, their breath misting in the cold air. When they were far enough from others, the old woman spoke quietly. "She'll report you again if you give her the chance. Women like that, they need someone to be better than, someone to condemn. It makes them feel righteous." "I know," Margaret said. "I'm being careful." "Careful isn't enough." Mistress MacLeod glanced around to ensure they were alone. "There's talk. Reverend Blackwell is writing to Boston, to the church authorities there. He wants permission to take stronger measures against what he calls persistent heresy." Margaret's stomach clenched. "What kind of measures?" "The kind they used in Europe. Interrogations, torture, trials. Not just stocks and public humiliation, real punishment. The kind that ends with burnings." The word hung between them like a curse. Margaret had heard stories, of course, everyone had. Stories of what had happened during the Great Purges, when the church had decided to eradicate paganism once and for all. Thousands had died, maybe tens of thousands. Their crime, remembering the old ways. "They wouldn't," Margaret whispered. "Not here, not in the new world." "Why not?" Mistress MacLeod's voice was hard. "What makes you think men are any different here than they were across the ocean? Fear is fear. Power is power. And Reverend Blackwell is a man who believes absolutely in his own righteousness. That makes him more dangerous than any simple tyrant." They reached Mistress MacLeod's small cottage at the edge of the settlement. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, The old woman bolted the door behind them and gestured for Margaret to sit. "I need to tell you something," Mistress MacLeod said. "Something I've never told anyone in this settlement." Margaret waited, her heart pounding. "I'm not just a widow who remembers some old customs," Mistress MacLeod began. "In Scotland, before I came here, I was part of a community. We kept the old festivals alive. Samhain, Beltane, the solstices and equinoxes. We honored the cycles of nature and the spirits of our ancestors. We weren't druids. That tradition died centuries ago, but we held on to what fragments remained." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "The church came for us eventually. They always do. My husband was arrested first, accused of witchcraft, of consorting with demons. They tortured him for 3 days, trying to get him to confess, to name others in our community. He never did. He died in their custody." Margaret reached out instinctively, touching the old woman's hand. "I fled," Mistress MacLeod continued. "Left everything. Came here thinking I could start over, thinking I could forget. But you can't forget, not really. The memories are carved into your bones." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret asked softly. "Because you need to understand what's at stake. What Reverend Blackwell represents. He's not just a strict minister. He's part of a larger movement, a campaign to ensure that the old ways die completely. And he won't stop with you. He'll come for all of us eventually, everyone who stood up that day, everyone who still remembers." Margaret felt cold despite the fire. "What can we do?" "We can leave," Mistress MacLeod said bluntly. "Pack up, move to another settlement, somewhere Reverend Blackwell's influence doesn't reach. Thomas will never agree to that. This is our home. We've built a life here. Then we can stay and hide, practice nothing, remember nothing, let the old ways die in silence." Margaret's jaw set. "No. Or," Mistress MacLeod said slowly, "we can fight, not with violence. We'd lose that battle, but with persistence, with community, by showing that what we remember isn't evil or demonic, it's human, it's connection, it's love." "How?" The old woman leaned forward. "By teaching the next generation, by telling them the stories, by explaining that before the church came, our people had their own ways of understanding life and death, their own sacred days, their own connections to the land and the seasons. We can't stop Reverend Blackwell from preaching, but we can make sure that when our children and grandchildren hear his sermons, they also hear another voice, a quieter voice, the voice of memory." Margaret thought of Catherine, her eldest daughter, thought of what she might teach her, not in defiance of the church but alongside it, a both-and rather than an either-or. "It's risky," Margaret said. "Everything worth doing is risky," Mistress MacLeod replied. "Your grandmother knew that. She taught you anyway. Now you have to decide, will you do the same for your children?" Over the following months, a quiet resistance took shape, not organized, not formal, just a network of families who made sure their children knew where they came from, who explained carefully that long ago their ancestors celebrated differently, honored the dead differently, understood the world differently. The stories were told in whispers, in private moments. A grandmother teaching a granddaughter to carve a turnip, explaining the symbolism. A father telling his son about the Celtic calendar, about how they marked time by seasons and harvests rather than Roman months. A mother sharing recipes that had been passed down for generations, each one carrying not just instructions for food, but memories of those who had made it before. Reverend Blackwell continued his campaign from the pulpit. His sermons grew darker, more apocalyptic. He spoke of spiritual warfare, of the devil's persistence, of how evil never truly died but simply changed forms. And perhaps he was right in a way. Perhaps the old traditions weren't dying. Perhaps they were simply transforming, adapting, learning to survive in a hostile environment by becoming smaller, quieter, harder to see. But the Reverend wasn't content with sermons. In the spring, he received his response from the church authorities in Boston. Margaret heard about it from Thomas, who had been present when Elder Whitmore announced it to the settlement's men. "They're sending an inquisitor," Thomas said, his face pale. "A specialist in rooting out heresy. He'll arrive before summer, and he has authority to conduct formal trials." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Trials like the ones in Europe?" Thomas nodded slowly. Elder Whitmore tried to argue against it, said we'd handled our problems internally. But Reverend Blackwell convinced them that the settlement was in spiritual danger, that without intervention, paganism would spread like a disease. That evening, Margaret gathered with the others, Mistress MacLeod, Connor Walsh, and the rest who had stood up for her months ago. They met in the woods outside the settlement in a small clearing where they couldn't be overheard. We have to leave, Connor said immediately. All of us, before the inquisitor arrives. And go where? Another asked. Every settlement has a minister. Every colony has laws against heresy. We could go west, someone suggested, into the wilderness, build our own community, and die of starvation or disease or attacks within a year, Mistress MacLeod said flatly. We are not pioneers. Most of us are farmers, tradesmen. We need community, we need structure. Then what do you suggest? Connor demanded. We wait here and let them arrest us one by one? Let them torture us until we confess to consorting with devils we've never even believed in? The group fell silent. The weight of their situation pressed down on them all. Margaret spoke quietly. We stay, but we change tactics. We don't hide, but we don't provoke either. We become model Christians. We attend every service. We volunteer for every church duty. We memorize scripture. We become so visibly pious that even an inquisitor can't find fault. While still remembering? Connor sounded skeptical. While still remembering, Margaret confirmed. In our hearts, in our private moments, but giving them nothing to prosecute. No turnips on doorsteps, no offerings, no visible customs, just memory, just stories told quietly to our children. Can they arrest us for what we think, for what we teach in whispers? They have before, Mistress MacLeod said grimly. But perhaps not here, not yet. Perhaps if we're careful enough we can survive this. They agreed reluctantly to try Margaret's approach. Over the following weeks, the dozen families became the most observant church members in the settlement. They arrived early to services and stayed late. They contributed more to the church's coffers. They volunteered to help maintain the building. They quoted scripture in conversation. Reverend Blackwell watched them with suspicion, but could find nothing to criticize. They were, on the surface, exactly what he'd wanted them to be. Reformed sinners who had returned to the fold. But beneath that surface, the memories persisted. The stories continued. The quiet resistance endured. And when the inquisitor finally arrived on a hot day in June, stepping off a wagon from Boston, with his black robes and his case of interrogation tools, he found a settlement that appeared, at least outwardly, to be in perfect spiritual order. But appearances, as Margaret had learned, could be deceiving, and the real test was only just beginning. The inquisitor's name was Father Cornelius Thorne, and he had the eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering and had learned to see it as holy work. He moved into a room in the meeting house and immediately began his investigation, calling families one by one to answer his questions. Margaret knew her turn would come, knew that all their careful piety might not be enough, knew that Father Thorne was trained to find heresy even where none existed, to extract confessions through methods both psychological and physical. She prepared herself for the worst, but she also prepared her children, teaching them carefully what to say and what not to say, teaching them that there were truths you shared and truths you kept hidden, teaching them, in essence, how to survive in a world that wanted to erase who they were. And late at night, when everyone else was asleep, Margaret would whisper her grandmother's name into the darkness, would remember the bonfire's light, would hold on to the memories that had cost her so much, because that was the only victory available now. Not triumph, not freedom, just persistence, just the stubborn refusal to forget. It would have to be enough. Father Cornelius Thorne conducted his interrogations with the precision of a surgeon. He sat behind a heavy wooden table in the meeting house, a Bible open on one side, a leather journal on the other. He took notes in a cramped, meticulous hand, recording every answer, every hesitation, every flicker of fear that crossed his subjects' faces. Margaret's summons came 3 weeks after his arrival. She walked to the meeting house with Thomas beside her, her hands steady despite the terror thrumming through her veins. She had prepared for this, had rehearsed her answers, had prayed to the Christian God and to the older powers she couldn't quite name for strength. Father Thorne was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with sharp features and grey threading through his dark hair. His eyes were his most unsettling feature, pale blue and utterly cold, as if he'd trained himself to feel nothing while doing terrible things. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." She sat. Thomas remained standing behind her until Father Thorne waved him away. "I'll speak with your wife alone. Wait outside." Thomas hesitated, then obeyed. The door closed. Margaret was alone with the inquisitor. "I've heard much about you," Father Thorne began, his voice mild, conversational. "You caused quite a disturbance last autumn, persisted in pagan practices despite punishment, nearly died in the stocks, I understand." I was punished for honoring my grandmother's memory, Margaret said carefully. I've since learned to express my devotion in ways that don't conflict with the Church's teachings. Have you? Father Thorn leaned forward slightly. Tell me about your grandmother. What exactly did she teach you? Margaret had prepared for this question. She taught me to be kind to others, to remember those who came before us, to mark the seasons and give thanks for harvests. Simple things. Did she teach you about Samhain? The word hung in the air between them. Margaret nodded slowly. She told me it was an old festival, a time when our people remembered the dead. Your people being the Celts, pagans who worshipped false gods. My people being Irish Catholics who had their own traditions alongside the Church's teachings, Margaret corrected gently. The two existed together for centuries. Father Thorn's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? This blending, this contamination of pure Christian faith with pagan remnants. The Church spent centuries purging these influences, and yet they persist like a disease that refuses to be cured. He opened his journal to a marked page. I have testimonies here from your neighbors. Goodwife Parsons reports seeing you leave offerings outside your door on multiple occasions, not just last year, but in previous years as well. She says you carved strange symbols into vegetables, that you spoke words in a language she didn't understand. I left bread and milk as a gesture of hospitality, Margaret said. I carved turnips because my grandmother taught me how, and it reminded me of her. I spoke Irish prayers. None of this is heretical. Prayers to whom? To God? Or to the spirits you believe walk the earth on Samhain night? Margaret chose her words carefully. I pray to God for the souls of the dead, as the Church teaches us to do on All Souls' Day. But you do it on the wrong day, on October 31st instead of November 2nd, on the pagan festival instead of the Christian one. The dates are close together, Margaret pointed out. Surely the intent matters more than the specific calendar day? Father Thorn sat back, studying her. You're clever. You've learned how to frame your practices in acceptable terms. But I'm very good at seeing through such deceptions, Margaret. I've interrogated hundreds of heretics. I know all the ways they try to hide their true beliefs. He paused, letting the threat sink in. Let me tell you what I know about Samhain. It was the highest holy day of the Druid calendar, a night when the barrier between the living and the dead supposedly disappeared. When spirits walked freely among mortals, the Druids performed blood sacrifices. Animals, sometimes humans. They practiced divination, trying to see the future. They invoked demons in the guise of ancestors. I've never performed a blood sacrifice, Margaret said firmly. I've never invoked demons. I left food for my grandmother's memory, that's all. Is it? Father Thorn leaned forward again. What about the others? The dozen families who stood up for you, what do they practice? What secrets do you share? So that was it. He didn't just want her confession. He wanted her to betray the others, to name them, to give him evidence he could use to expand his investigation. Margaret met his eyes steadily. They're good Christian families. They attend church faithfully. They follow the commandments. Whatever they may have done in the past, they've reformed. Reformed, Father Thorn repeated, or simply hidden their practices more carefully. I can only speak to what I see, and I see people who love God and try to live righteously. The inquisitor studied her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to a chest in the corner of the room. When he returned, he carried several items that he placed on the table between them. A pair of thumbscrews, a thin metal rod designed to be heated in fire, a leather strap studded with small spikes. These are the tools of my trade, Father Thorn said calmly. I prefer not to use them. I find that most people, when confronted with the reality of what awaits them, choose to confess honestly rather than endure unnecessary suffering. Margaret stared at the instruments of torture. Her mouth went dry. She thought of the stocks, of the 3 days that had nearly killed her. These tools promised worse, much worse. I have authority from the church in Boston to use whatever methods are necessary to root out heresy in this settlement, Father Thorn continued. I can have you arrested, confined, interrogated properly, and this time there will be no magistrate to release you after 3 days. You'll remain in my custody until I'm satisfied that you've told me everything. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. She clenched them together to stop the shaking. What do you want from me? The truth, all of it. What you practice, what you believe. Who else shares these beliefs? The full extent of the pagan corruption in this settlement. And if I tell you there is no corruption, that we're simply families trying to honor our heritage while also being faithful Christians, Then I'll know you're lying, and we'll proceed to more persuasive methods of questioning. The threat was clear. Margaret could confess, could betray herself and everyone else, or she could refuse and face torture. There was no third option. She thought of her grandmother, thought of Mistress MacLeod's husband, who had died under torture without betraying his community, thought of all the thousands who had suffered for the crime of remembering, and she made her choice. I have nothing more to tell you, Father Thorn. I've been honest about my practices, I've explained my intentions. If that's not sufficient, then do what you must. But I won't invent confessions to please you, and I won't condemn innocent people to satisfy your investigation. Father Thorn's expression hardened. You're choosing pain over truth. I'm choosing truth over false confession, Margaret corrected. The Inquisitor gathered his tools and returned them to the chest. You're dismissed for now, but I'll be watching you, Margaret O'Sullivan. You and your friends. And when I find evidence, and I will find it, there will be no mercy. Margaret stood on shaking legs and walked out of the meeting house. Thomas was waiting outside, his face strained with worry. He took her arm to steady her. What happened? He threatened me with torture, wanted me to confess to heresy and name others. Did you? No. Thomas pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe, Margaret whispered against his chest. But I won't be the one who destroys this community. I won't give him the weapons to use against us. Over the following weeks, Father Thorn interrogated every family in the settlement. He was thorough, methodical, relentless. He took testimony from children, from servants, from anyone who might provide information. He searched homes looking for evidence of pagan practices. He watched the townspeople constantly, noting who spoke to whom, who seemed nervous, who might be hiding something. But he found nothing concrete. The families who remembered the old ways had become too careful. Their practices had gone so deep underground that even an expert inquisitor couldn't unearth them. Frustrated, Father Thorn turned to more aggressive tactics. He arrested Connor Walsh on vague charges of suspicious behavior and held him for 3 days of interrogation. Connor emerged pale and shaken, but having confessed nothing. The inquisitor tried the same with 2 other families, with similar results. The settlement lived under a cloud of fear. People stopped talking to each other except when necessary. Suspicion poisoned relationships. Parents stopped teaching their children anything that might be considered questionable. The quiet resistance that Margaret had worked to build seemed to be crumbling under the pressure. In August, Father Thorn called a special gathering at the meeting house. The entire settlement attended, crowding into the building despite the summer heat. The Inquisitor stood at the front, his face grave. I have spent 3 months in your community, 3 months investigating reports of heresy and pagan practices, and while I have found abundant evidence that such practices existed, I have not been able to secure the confessions necessary to proceed with formal trials. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Relief, hope. But Father Thorn wasn't finished. However, I have concluded that this settlement has been infected with spiritual corruption. The example set by Margaret O'Sullivan last autumn, her defiant persistence in pagan customs, has poisoned the community. Therefore, I am recommending to the church authorities in Boston that this settlement be placed under permanent ecclesiastical supervision. A special deputy will be appointed to monitor your spiritual lives. Any deviation from proper Christian practice will be investigated immediately and punished severely. He paused, his cold gaze sweeping across the assembled townspeople. Furthermore, I am ordering that all traditional practices of Irish and Scottish origin, all folk customs, all old songs, all heritage festivals, be permanently banned. You will become proper English Christians, purged of the pagan contamination you brought from your homelands. This is not optional. This is not negotiable. This is the price of remaining in this community. The shock was palpable. Fathers and mothers looked at each other in dismay. To ban all their heritage, all their traditions, it was cultural annihilation. Mistress MacLeod stood slowly. And if we refuse, Father Thorn turned his cold eyes on her, then you will be tried for heresy and face the appropriate punishment, which is death by burning, Father Thorn said flatly, as has been the Church's practice for centuries when dealing with obstinate heretics. The meeting house fell silent. The threat was absolute. Submit completely or die. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that Father Thorn, for all his experience, hadn't anticipated. Margaret O'Sullivan stood. Then Thomas stood beside her. Then Mistress MacLeod. Then Connor Walsh. Then, one by one, Family by family, the dozen who had first supported Margaret rose to their feet. "We refuse," Margaret said clearly. Father Thorn's face flushed with anger. "You're confessing to heresy, all of you. You understand what that means?" "We understand," Margaret said. "We're saying that our heritage is not heresy, that remembering where we came from is not devil worship. That honoring our ancestors is not the same as invoking demons, and we will not let you erase us." "Then you've all condemned yourselves," Father Thorn spat. "I'll have the magistrate arrest every one of you. I'll build enough pyres to burn you all." Elder Whitmore stood from his seat near the front. The old magistrate looked exhausted, aged beyond his years by the months of tension. "No, Father Thorn." "You won't." The inquisitor whirled on him. "I have authority from Boston." "You have authority to investigate and make recommendations," Elder Whitmore interrupted. "But I am still the magistrate of this settlement, and I will not execute a dozen families for remembering their grandmother's recipes and songs. I won't tear this community apart because they carved turnips or spoke Irish prayers. This is obstruction of—" "This is me exercising my authority," Elder Whitmore said firmly. "You've done your investigation. You found no evidence of actual devil worship, no blood sacrifices, no demonic rituals. Just people trying to balance their heritage with their faith. That's not heresy. That's being human." Father Thorn's face contorted with rage. "The church will hear about this, about your refusal to enforce their directives, about your tolerance of paganism." "Let them hear," Elder Whitmore said wearily. "I'm an old man. I've seen enough suffering. I won't add to it by burning people for loving their grandmothers." The inquisitor gathered his things with sharp, angry movements. "You're all damned, every one of you. You'll answer for this apostasy in the next life, if not in this one." He stormed out of the meeting house. Within 2 days, he was gone from the settlement entirely, returning to Boston to file his reports. In the weeks that followed, the settlement slowly returned to something like normalcy. The fear lifted. People began talking to each other again, and while they remained cautious, while they understood that Father Thorn's reports might bring future consequences, they also understood that they had survived. Margaret stood in her doorway on the evening of October 31st, a year after her ordeal in the stocks. She held a carved turnip in her hands, its candle flickering in the autumn darkness. Thomas stood beside her. Their children watched from inside the house. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked quietly. "After everything?" Margaret smiled. "I'm sure. This is who we are. This is what we remember, and no amount of threats or torture or fear will change that." She placed the turnip on the doorstep. One by one, other lights appeared in the darkness. Mistress MacLeod's house, Connor Walsh's home, all the others who had stood up. Small acts of defiance, small flames against the darkness. The church had tried to erase Samhain, had condemned it, persecuted it, tried to burn it out of existence. But here, in this small settlement at the edge of the wilderness, it persisted. Changed, yes, hidden, yes, but alive. Margaret thought of her grandmother, thought of all those who had come before, who had kept the old ways alive through centuries of persecution, thought of all those who would come after, who would inherit these memories. The dead weren't truly gone, she understood now. They lived in the stories told by firelight, in the customs passed down through generations, in the stubborn refusal to forget. The veil between worlds was thin tonight, and standing in her doorway with her turnip glowing and her family safe beside her, Margaret O'Sullivan knew that her grandmother was watching, was proud, was remembered. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. Not triumph over the church, not revenge against those who had persecuted her, just memory, just the quiet, persistent act of refusing to let the past die. The flames flickered in the darkness. The old festival continued, and the souls of those who had died for celebrating this night, who had faced the stocks and the torture and the flames, finally found peace. They had not died in vain. They had not been forgotten. Their traditions lived on, transformed but unbroken, carried forward by people who understood that some things were worth suffering for. Margaret closed her door against the October cold. Inside, her family gathered around the fire, and she began to tell her children the stories her grandmother had told her, stories of the old ways of Samhain, of the thin places between worlds. The church might try to silence these stories, might condemn them as heresy, but as long as even one person remembered, as long as even one voice continued to whisper in the darkness, the old ways would survive. And that was how Margaret O'Sullivan won her war. Not with violence or rebellion, but with memory, with the simple radical act of refusing to forget who she was and where she came from. The persecution would continue. In other places, in other times, people would still die for celebrating Halloween's pagan roots. But here, in this moment, in this small settlement, memory had proven stronger than fear, and the light of a carved turnip, burning against the autumn darkness, was enough.